I had an unusual childhood. I started first grade when I was 4. And until I was 5, I didn't know English. I was born in the Bronx in New York City. Both my parents were born in New York City. They were born in Brownsville and Brooklyn. And my parents decided that the only way that they felt that I could be assured of being able to connect with Jews all over the world is if I would learn Yiddish. And so that was it. I only spoke Yiddish until I was 5 years old. I didn't understand a word of English, which is, I would say, probably unusual. My younger sister as well. We were raised only in Yiddish in the house. We spoke Yiddish in the street. I didn't have a lot of friends because there wasn't too much Yiddish going around in the Bronx. And at the age of 4, I started first grade in the Lubavitcher Yeshiva in the Bronx. My parents were very friendly with the principal, and I started when I was 4 years old, first grade. I learned English in the Chabad Yeshiva. When I was 5, my parents decided to skip me. So I skipped second grade. So I was 5 years old in third grade. I graduated elementary school, therefore, when I was 10. Now, I was always short, and I was short then too. It was very challenging for me. The reason why I skipped is because the principal wanted his son to skip, and I was good friends with him, and so he wanted me to keep his son company, so I skipped. It was very difficult for me socially and intellectually. When I was 8, 9, I was in the stupid class in the school. I was lost intellectually. I wasn't doing well at all. But I couldn't go to high school when I was 10, so I had to go to another elementary school to redo 7th and 8th grade. So I could go to high school when I did at the age of 12. I was getting C's and D's, and my parents didn't understand why. They took me to a psychologist, and I had a test. They gave me a Rorschach test, and I remember the Rorschach ink blots very vividly. They asked me to draw a picture of myself, and the conclusion was that my IQ was higher than the grades that I was producing. And so the decision was that I should leave home to go to high school. Somehow, if I left home, maybe that would be helpful. So when I was 12, I left home and I went to high school. I went to a Haredi, ultra-Orthodox high school in Philadelphia, in the Yeshiva of Philadelphia. I came home for Shabbat for my bar mitzvah. I got permission to leave to go home for my bar mitzvah. And then Sunday I went back to Yeshiva. I was there for 5 years. I graduated high school when I was 16. I stayed an extra year of learning, full-time Talmud study. And I left after 5 years to go to Israel, to study for a year in Israel in a more modern yeshiva. Those days, this was 1968, there weren't the plethora of gap year programs, both for men and for women, that we have today. There was essentially one school. It was known as Yeshivat Kerem B'Yavne, sort of a modern Orthodox option. And I was accepted to go to Kerem B'Yavne. But one thing led to another, and I ended up in the Yeshivat Mir, in the Mir Yeshiva in Yerushalayim. And I was there for a year and a half. And then I came back to the United States. I started going to a yeshiva in Brooklyn, Mesifta Torah V'das, and 6 months later I started to go to college, to Brooklyn College at night. At that point, I didn't feel comfortable attending Yeshiva University. It was too modern for me. I was much more rooted in the more ultra-Orthodox world, even though my parents are modern Orthodox. My father was a very prominent modern Orthodox rabbi. But I was more influenced by my schooling than I was by my parental upbringing. And it was only after 2 or 3 years of attending Brooklyn College that I began to come back to the middle And I got rabbinic ordination from this school, Mesivta Torah V'das, when I got my BA from Brooklyn College in 1973. And I went off to Harvard to study Jewish studies. So I ended up somehow back in the middle, even though I started, or my formative high school and post-high school years, 6, 7, 8 years, I spent squarely ensconced in the world of the yeshiva.
So when you look back at this very rich and complex childhood, what are the lessons, the major lessons that you take from your father and from your mother? What are the most important teachings, most important life lessons that you've taken from your father, Zichrona Livracha, and your mother, Yibad
Well, first I
L'Chaim?
would say that I was upset at them for a long time because how could they put me in first grade when I was 4 and then skip second grade? So it didn't work for me. And my mother would always tell me, and even today I had a conversation. I said to her, I'm coming here tonight. She said, don't say bad things about me. So I said to her, I'm not going to say anything bad, but I'm going to tell them, and I'm going to tell you now what I told her I'm going to tell you, that my mother said to me when I expressed wonderment as to how this could happen. She said to me, because she spoke to me in Yiddish for so many years, and for many years my parents called me by my diminutive Hebrew name. I'm Jacob Joseph, which is JJ, which is Yaakov Yosef, which in Yiddish is Yaakov Yosefol. There's the full, the ending there, the la ending, which is the diminutive of a name, or Shloima la. Sometimes it's a la, sometimes it's an o. She said, Yaakov Yosefol, I promise you, I was probably 40 then when we had this conversation. I promise you I will never do it again. That's what she said to me. So I thanked her, and we're friends and we love each other. So I think the first thing I would learn is to be maybe a little bit more attuned to where your kids are and what they need and where they're up to. And it was a different world then. You know, you're raised in a world when that's much more obvious now. When I was growing up in the 50s, it wasn't that obvious. There wasn't that level of, I would say, psychological awareness or sophistication. So I think we're blessed to have that, and I think it's important when we think about our own kids, please God someday, to recognize that we need to be really forensically careful and thoughtful about how we help move them along in their own life's trajectory. My father was a massive figure in my life. My father was a pulpit rabbi in the Bronx. My father was the first chaplain to enter into the concentration camps in the Second World War. He was a chaplain in the Army. He joined the Army. He graduated from Yeshiva College in 1938. He studied for rabbinic ordination. He was a rabbi in Stamford, Connecticut, and joined the Army to fight Hitler and to help Jews. Now, he had no idea what that meant. People didn't really know what that meant. People really didn't have a sense of what was going on. But he knew that as an American, he was an American patriot for his entire life. He was very devoted to America, while he was at the same time the president of the Religious Zionists of America. He was very much of a Zionist. But he was a hero at the age of 27. He went into the concentration camp, and that was a major trope of my entire childhood and adulthood. This was a major piece. And the most moving experiences of my life is when we would meet people whose lives he saved. After the war, when he came into the concentration camp, he spent 10 weeks. And he brought people back to life. He brought people back to their humanity. He brought people back to some kind of a sense of a commitment to a tradition and to a future for the Jewish people. He arranged for a train to bring 300 orphans to Switzerland, and he, and following in the ways of God, resurrected people from the dead, literally. And I heard this not only from him, but from people who he had an impact. I remember the most profound, probably the most profound, one of the most profound experiences of my life was in 1967. We were in Israel for the summer. It was right after the Six-Day War. And I'm sure many, if not all of you, have been to Israel, to Jerusalem. And we're walking down Rehov Melech David, King George Street, and we're walking down towards Keren HaYesod. We're walking, Yafa was behind us, so we're walking down the hill. And we come to the last block before Keren HaYesod. So on the right side is the Jewish Agency building. Then there are a few little ice cream stores and bookstores, and then there's what today is the Great Synagogue, which then was just an empty lot, and then there's Heichal Shlomo, which used to be the seat of the chief rabbinate, and then there's the King's Hotel. We're walking down the block, 1967, and coming towards us are two ultra-Orthodox Jews, men, maybe in their late 30s, 40s. They're talking to each other, and we're walking, and they're coming towards us. All of a sudden, out of the periphery of my vision, I see them stop, and they start to stare, and they start to stare. And then we stopped, and we looked at them, and they looked at my father, and then both of them ran over to him, poured themselves around him, bawling uncontrollably, unable to let go of him. It lasted maybe for 10 seconds. It seemed like it lasted for a minute. Composed themselves, moved away, and left, and never said a word. And I knew exactly what that was. I was 16. I knew what that was. These were two young children whom my father saved. There were no words that they could describe. What are they going to say to him? This is the first time they saw him since 1945. So for me, it's a mixed, it was complicated. On the one hand, I was very proud of my father, very, very proud. When my father died 2 years ago, his obituary was on the front page of the New York Times. That's a big deal. Obituary on the front page of the New York Times. So it was below the fold, it wasn't on top of the fold. Okay, so well, it wasn't above the fold on the front page of the New York Times, but I don't know if that matters to you, but it would have mattered to my dad. But he's smiling in heaven that he made the front page of the New York. It's a big deal. Big deal. So I learned from him to care for the Jewish people, that really means a lot. But it was also a struggle for my entire life to crawl out from under the shadow of my father. What could I ever do in my whole life that could even remotely begin to resemble the heroism that he expressed? How many lives am I literally going to save? How many Hitlers am I going to go and fight? How many armies am I going to be a part of? How many Jews can I help shape in such a profound way for the rest of their lives? Just last week, Tuesday night, there was a program in the Holocaust Museum. And the main speaker was Rabbi Yisrael Meir Lau, was the former chief rabbi of Israel. He's now the chief rabbi of Tel Aviv, Ashkenazi chief rabbi. And my father liberated him. He has 5 pages in his book telling the story. So they called me and asked me if I would speak, and then if I would introduce him. And then I was introduced by 2 fellows, basically my age, who for about 5 minutes each talked about how my father saved their mother, their grandmother, their great-grandmother, their aunt, and their uncle, both of them, each one separate families. And then I got up to speak, and the first thing I said was, obviously, I'm not here for me. I'm here because I'm representing my father. So on the one hand, it's very special. On the other hand, it's crushing. It's crushing. I think our relationships with our parents are fascinating. And I think each one of us negotiates the nature of our relationship with our parents. Our parents play different kinds of roles for us. And, I once heard a beautiful thought from Shlomo Carlebach, if I may.
Sure.
He was talking about how do you grow up? Shlomo Carlebach was a very famous singer and songwriter and played a very, very profound role in my life growing. I learned to play guitar. I play guitar because I wanted to be like Shlomo. I had this thought that if I would have a son, I don't, I have daughters, I would name my son Shlomo because I just was so attached to him. He used to call me Top Holy JJ. We had this relationship. He used to give me a bracha on my head. He used to give me blessings. He once said to me, children have to leave parents because children need to create their own identity. But children should leave parents the way in Jewish tradition a person walks away from the Western Wall, from the Kotel HaMa'aravi. So traditionally, how do people walk away from the Western Wall? So you walk backwards a little bit. You don't just turn around and walk away. You'll see if next time you're there, you'll see people, it's like the end of the central prayer of the liturgy 3 times a day. One walks backwards. So he said, you have to separate yourself, but walk backwards. Walk backwards means you're moving away from them, but you're still connected to them. And the nature of that connection differs for all of us. And that's something to think about. And that's an issue for me still. My father's gone 2 years. I've become closer to him since his passing. I've somehow been able to be more in touch with the positive and the transcendent. I learned faith from my mother. My mother is a woman of absolute powerful faith, unadorned, and my father was big, and by big I mean a big presence, and then spoke with fervor, and was a big rabbi. And my mother had quiet faith, but sincere, honest faith. Her father died on the second day of Passover. So according to Jewish tradition, there's no mourning on the holiday. And here it is the second day of Passover. And I remember after she got the news, she called my sister and me in. I was 7 years old. And she sat us down on her bed. And she said, I want to tell you a story. Her father died an hour ago on the second day of Passover. There was once a rabbi by the name of Rabbi Meir. And he had 2 sons. And they died. And the rabbis tell us that his wife had to figure out a way how to inform her husband that their children died. So she said, I have a question to ask you. If somebody lends you an object and then they come to take it away, do you have to give it to them? And Rabbi Meir said, of course, it's not your object. It belongs to somebody else. They come to claim it. You have to give it to them. So the rabbis say that she, Mrs. Meir, and it's sad that we don't really know the names of the missuses. That's one of the good things about modernity, that we know the names of the missuses. Said to her husband, well, God gave us 2 gifts, and God came to take them away. Our children died. And my mother turned to me and she said, God gave us a gift. And now God came to take away my father. I still remember until today the kind of an impact that made. That was extremely deep and profound, and acknowledging the divinity even at the moment of the greatest loss. No, it's almost 60 years ago. It's a big deal for me. And my mom is still alive. She's going to turn 92. It's hard for her to walk, but she's sharp, and wonderful, and a source of tremendous blessing. So I don't know if this is what
This is great.
where you wanted to go with this, but here's where I am.
This is pretty heavy. This is good.
Heavy is good. I'm in for honest.
All right. So let me push the envelope just one more step, if I may.
Yeah.
Did you ever speak to your dad about his presence in your life?
Yeah, but he didn't really get it. My father was the youngest of 10 children. My father was born when his father was in his 50s. My father had nephews older than he was. The first 2, 3, 4 got married, had kids before he was born. He was raised in a different time. It wasn't resolved for me that way. But now it's remarkable to me. I'm really in a wonderful place. I talk to him all the time. I thank him. I'm very comfortable now.
That's great.
It's a big, big blessing.
Right. So, switching gears.
You can push wherever you want to push, and I'll either respond or not.
That sounds fair. So you are a professional historian, a very accomplished historian. Why history?
I had a professional choice early on, which, as my life unfolded, did not have to be a mutually exclusive choice. I was very much influenced by my father, who was a rabbi. I wanted to be a different kind of a rabbi, but I wanted to be a rabbi because he was a rabbi. And the other Shlomo, who played a very central role in my early years, is Rabbi Shlomo Riskin, who now lives in Israel, in Efrat. He was in the news recently. There was a brouhaha with the chief rabbinate. Rabbi Riskin was a rabbi not far from here on the west side, Lincoln Square Synagogue. And he was a young fellow, he was maybe in the 30, and he was a big role model for me. So I wanted to be a rabbi. In 1981, so I got rabbinic ordination. I was very interested in Jewish history. For me, Jewish history represented a way of living. It's also very personal. It's a way of maintaining my Jewishness in the world of the academia. When I came back from Israel, it was a very hard transition for me to go from the Mir Yeshiva in Jerusalem, which is, serious, very intense, tremendous learning. It's in Mea Sha'arim and Beit Yisrael in Jerusalem. It's a very intense neighborhood, a lot of piety and learning and thoughtfulness and spirituality. And then I came to New York, and it was very different, and it was very hard for me. And then I bumped into a professor at Brooklyn College by the name of David Berger, who teaches today at Yeshiva University, who modeled for me traditional learning in an academic context. So he would teach medieval Jewish history, and he would talk about, I'm going to mention names of very significant medieval Jewish intellectuals, Reb Shlomo Ibn Adret, Moses Nachmanides, even into the more modern period. And he would talk about these figures in the college classroom. And that enabled me to be able to bridge that world with the world of academia. And so after I got rabbinic ordination, I decided that I would go to become a Jewish historian. And I went to study with Professor Tversky at Harvard, and also Professor Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi. It's a name also that should be familiar to you. If not, it should be familiar to you. Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi, very formidable professor, wonderful. These were my two major teachers. And after a couple of years, I was feeling guilty because I was spending all of my time in Widener Library. That's the main library in Harvard. And I wasn't doing anything for the Jewish people, and it began to bother me. And year after year after year, my parents were supporting us, and I was married, and I had already a child, and I'm 10 hours a day in the library, and I'm learning, and I'm reading, and what am I doing for the Jews? So I became a rabbi in a small town in Sharon. Rabbi Gottlieb mentioned it earlier. There were 12 families in this community. We were the 13th family. After 4 years, there were 80 families. And in 81, I had a choice. I was up for a tenure track position at Yale, and I was up for the Jewish Center, which is this big, fancy shul synagogue on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. And at that moment, I made a decision that I'm going to go for the synagogue. And I went for it, and I got it. And for 19 years, I was a rabbi of the synagogue. But I kept my head in the world of academia. And I'm fascinated. I'm fascinated by history. I'm fascinated by tradition. I'm fascinated by the lessons that we could learn from history, both positive as well as negative. Things that we should learn that we should do, things that we should learn that we shouldn't do. I think a lot of the challenges that we face today were faced in earlier times. How do you balance personal and communal? How do you balance individual and tradition? These are issues that are consistently part of our heritage, and I'm fascinated by it. I'm fascinated by stories, by human interest stories. I wrote my dissertation on somebody who was, I would say, arguably the most interesting rabbinic figure like ever. He wrote an autobiography, which my current book is finally to finish. I'm very close to finish a critical edition of his autobiography, which is one of the most remarkable documents in Jewish literature. It's just shockingly self-revelatory. There is nothing. You let your mind wander without stop, he writes about it. It's shockingly
Give us a juicy nugget or two.
Self-revelatory. I have a contract with Yale to translate it into English.
So you can't say anything yet?
He talks about his sexual feelings. He talks about his body. He talks about his parents. He talks about the girl he wanted to marry and his father didn't let him marry. He talks about his wives. I don't mean talk about, writes about. Rabbi Jacob Emden. Yaakov Emden, 18th century Germany. Fascinating. And I'm fascinated by real world. And that's why I wrote this article. I wrote a long article many years ago arguing against the obfuscation of history, arguing against dishonesty in history. We have to be honest, we have to face the facts, and we have to, chips fall when they fall. We have to struggle with it because it's a real world and it matters.
So you just alluded to this, I would say, magisterial article facing the truths of history, and you identify this revisionist tendency in much of sort of modern Haredi literature and the public consciousness of the Haredi community. Do you see evidence of this in the modern Orthodox community as well? Mm-hmm. Do you see it in other forms of other denominations, other traditions, other communities within Judaism, or is it more a function of a particular Haredi worldview and ideology?
I'm happy to answer that, but I just want to go back to something I said earlier just as
Sure.
a takeaway. One of the things that I take away from my growing up is role models. I mentioned three names in the course of the last few minutes: Shlomo Carlebach, Shlomo Riskin, and David Berger. I think it's really important for you to find them and to develop relationships with them and to have them play a role in your lives. I don't mean them. One of them is going to be really difficult. Find role models. Fill your lives. Now, there can't be too many because not that many people can have such a profound impact on you. But, aseh lecha rav, we are taught, make for yourself a teacher. I would ask you, when you get home tonight, take out a piece of paper and say, my role models are, and who would you put down? Who's on that list for you personally? And if they're alive, tomorrow, after 5 o'clock, right
after class,
after
right.
class,
and the Shemitah exhibit. No.
Oh, so the next day, Thursday, call them. CALL them. Call them. say, I'd like to get together. I've been thinking about you. I want to get together. Because they're going to be dead soon, or not so soon, and you're going to miss them. Grab hold of them. Enjoy them. Learn from them. And tell them what they mean to you. Tell them what they mean to you. Thank them for being such a formidable figure in your lives. It's a big deal. Expressing gratitude is a big deal. When you're young, you think you're going to live forever, and you're not really that much in most cases. You don't really come so face to face with the finality of death. Yes, of course we do, our grandparents, uncle, but it happens. And you're in a blessed position to access these people. I'm actually very sensitive to being characterized as somebody who's only reacting to a particular slice of the contemporary community. I go out of my way to be respectful and to be kind and to give the benefit of the doubt. So yeah, I think the tendency to try to put great figures on a pedestal is pretty much cross-cultural. Some communities may have that more than others. Some communities may be less sensitive to or value the truths of history and are prepared to play more loose with historical truth. But I certainly understand why somebody would want to do that. And it raises a much larger issue. I'll just say what the issue is and you'll tell me if you want to go there. And that is, what's the real purpose of being on earth? What's the real purpose of what's our role as Jews in the world today? And I think that's really where it is. This is a much larger issue. And if our role is to, and I actually believe that it is, for me, this is very personal again, for me, that if our role is to try to take a tradition and then transmit the tradition, and we're parts of a chain to be able to do that, then maybe that's more important than being specifically focused on maintaining the so-called truths of history. Maybe there are values and truths that trump those values and truths. So it's a big conversation.
So I'd love to go there a little bit, because what you've stated is actually a real tension, if not a paradox, with the life of the historian or the professional life of the historian. Because on the one hand, you see history in the service of something larger, history in the service of your religious vocation, history in service of the health of the community. And yet, it's possible that without the truth, that you compromise the very ability to speak candidly and to connect to another generation, because you wear away the trust that's so critical for transmitting a tradition.
Yeah,
and so where do you make the call?
It's really a wonderful formulation, and I appreciate it. I make the call for truth. I mean, I personally make the call for truth. There is nothing that to me is legitimate to compromise truth. It's just simply not acceptable. But I understand where
you could understand the counter
I understand the counter narrative that argues there's something more important. And if that counter narrative suggests that saving or maintaining or preserving is the word I'm looking for, preserving the tradition can be done without paying full attention to the truths of history and it be effective, I can understand why somebody might want to do that.
Can you think for yourself, the most graphic or glaring example of an untruth that has been passed off as a truth that has had really damaging consequences to that community? Or something that's just curious in terms of
I give so many examples in this article, and it was almost 20 years ago. I don't
Or anything today,
remember.
I know Mark Shapiro's book recently came out, which touches on a similar topic within the modern Orthodox community, maybe.
Right. So I think some of the key touchstones in the contemporary community are the value of non-specifically Torah disciplines, the role of women, Zionism, relationships with non-Jews. These are key issues that are the battlefronts, certainly within the contemporary Orthodox community. And to the extent to which things that aren't true are used in support of any one of these positions, to me, that is simply unacceptable.
So you mentioned one of the tensions that we as moderns feel most profoundly is this tension between tradition and freedom, between tradition and autonomy. And you've written a number of articles in the past few years, including for the Rabbi Sachs Festschrift, that touch on this tension between tradition, traditional religion, and traditional commandedness, and the modern value of autonomy or freedom. What do you think is the next frontier in the halacha community or the Jewish community where this tradition and freedom battle is being waged and is playing out in real time?
I think that the most central current iteration of that tension is in issues that relate to women's role in traditional Jewish life. The complexity of negotiating between so-called tradition and freedom. We are products of 20th, 21st century America, which places a premium on personal autonomy and individual choice. And that's centrally important to us. That's part of our core identity. How does that fit? And this is not only a Jewish issue. This is a Catholic issue and a Protestant issue and a Muslim issue. Any religious tradition that seeks to be perpetuating itself has to grapple with how is it going to insist upon certain non-negotiables in a world that is governed by exactly the opposite of that. I think any traditional religion today in the United States, Western world, but I know most about the United States, is facing an uphill battle. It is the most countercultural thing possible. And the rubber's hitting the road now, I think most acutely with regard to the issue of the role of women in contemporary Jewish life, the women leaders, women in the synagogue, women in liturgy, ritual. That's, I think, where this tension is very much being played out most acutely today.
And how do you give someone guidance when a congregant or a colleague in the rabbinate, comes to you and you're looking at halachic sources, but there has to be some philosophy or some Jewish normative value that's shaping the conversation. And if we imbibe autonomy and say simply that it's a modern notion that's part and parcel of our experience, where do we get the wherewithal to limit that, or to say that maybe this is something that runs against the grain of tradition? Or do we find sources within the Jewish law that have precedent, or do we say that there's a theology that emanates from these sources that push us back into tradition?
The problem with both of those suggestions, and both of them are wonderful suggestions, is that they're only going to speak to somebody who's prepared to buy into that as a legitimate argument. If somebody says, my autonomous sensibilities are so strong that it is what it is, and you can bring me really sweet, interesting, intellectual proofs from this text or that text, and that sounds very interesting, but it's not going to affect my life because it doesn't have a hold on me, so then it's a non-starter for a conversation. I have this conversation with my students all the time. I teach a course in the rabbinical school at Yeshiva University. And I also interact, one of the things that I do is I interact with pulpit rabbis on a regular basis. And the key word that I use is humility. If you ask me what value needs to get into this conversation, it's humility. And humility means that you need to understand both sides. And you need to really understand both sides, and you need to respect both sides. You can't have a conversation without respecting both sides. And anybody, I think, who enters into this with either autonomy is the straight guiding consideration, or whatever my Bubby is my grandmother did, that's what I do because that's part of our tradition and not anything else is a deviation, and neither of them are being appropriate in this conversation. I think that we need to fully and deeply respect the importance of the tradition, and we need to fully and deeply respect what I consider to be the sincere, legitimate, authentic desire of women who want to expand their role within the tradition. How that's going to play itself out is a work in progress. But the first step is to be deeply immersed in trying to understand both of these perspectives.
When you think of your own personal spiritual practice, what guidelines would you give people that are seeking direction in their own spiritual life? What concrete forms do you particularly, take pleasure and attention in? How would you direct someone who's looking for this?
So first of all, that presupposes that there are people who are looking for this.
Yes.
I would say most of America is not looking for this. I would say the vast, vast, vast majority of America is not looking for this. Or at least they're not aware that they're looking for this. I don't know how many of you are looking for this. I'm assuming, based on the question, that this is a relevant category in this room.
This is a serious group.
One could be serious, but not necessarily seek spiritual depth.
It's true.
So what I'm saying is that the question needs to be taken very seriously and can be addressed in the context of where it matters. So I'm assuming it matters.
I'm asking it, so
know.
I'm personally very curious.
And I'm assuming it matters. It matters to me very much. It's a hard question to answer. I would say there are three levels that I have understood in my religious consciousness. There are three different categories. One category is the study of Torah. One category is the punctilious observance of Jewish law. And one category is the spiritual, emotional, interior connection to the tradition and to God. And I see them as interrelated, but three separate. For me, the first and the third resonate more. I love the study of Torah, which to me is not just an intellectual exercise, but it is connects me to God. And I mentioned before, I play guitar. I'm very emotional, and I relate to God in a very emotional way. When I pray, I feel that I have a personal relationship to God, that I'm actually praying to God, that I'm actually speaking to God. I was once at the Kotel, the Western Wall in Jerusalem, and it's many, many years ago, and a guy comes with a blind guy comes with a stick. He's making his way, and he's feeling his way, and he comes up to the wall, and he hits the wall, and then he touches the wall. He figures, I'm here. He bends down and puts down the stick, and he starts to caress the wall, the stones, the crevices. Maybe 30 seconds. And then he says the following in Hebrew. He says, God, I was here a couple of months ago, and I told you that my wife wasn't feeling well. She's really not doing well. I need you to help her. And my son is in the army now, I told you last time that he was thinking about going into the army. He's in the army now. I don't know where he is, but you know where he is, and I need you to look out for him. And I'm like 14 inches from this guy, and he's talking to God. And on the one hand, it's none of my business. I feel like moving away. On the other hand, are you kidding? I'm not budging because this is unbelievable. And then he starts talking about his daughter who's 27, who just doesn't have a boyfriend, and he's like heartbroken, and she went out on a date and it didn't work out, and she thought she had the guy. I am flabbergasted. And then he says, okay, God. He says, okay, God, I took up enough time. You're busy. So I'm going to stop now. But you understand where I am. Another 30 seconds. And he bends down, and he picks up his stick. He turns around, and he goes away. He doesn't pray. He doesn't say Psalms or pray the afternoon service. And I said to myself, do you have to be blind to see God so directly? That had such a profound influence on me. Talk to God. Hi, God. It's me, it's JJ. Remember me? Remember me? So on the one hand, it's incredibly empowering and meaningful. The other hand, I think it's like such chutzpah. Why the hell do I think that God is interested in listening to what I have to say? And I'm torn between these two poles all the time. I believe that God is very interested in what I have to say. And then I say, why should God give a whit care about what I have to say? But it's very profound, and it's very personal, and it's very emotional, and it doesn't have to do with, how to shake the lulav and how much you eat for the matzah and, what minute you're going to finish the Shema. I mean, that's a piece of it, but that's not what animates me in a really spiritual way. I do it because I'm committed to it. But that's not where my passion lies. It lies in the study of Torah, and it lies in talking to God. Rabbi Soloveitchik has this really beautiful image in this eulogy he gave for his there's no English word for it, not his in-law, but for the mother of his son-in-law. You mentioned Professor Machatenista.
Right.
Machatenista, which means their kid married your kid. That's what that means. And there's no English word. Isn't that fascinating? Any of you married?
One, we've got one here.
One, Mazel Tov. So you have parents, and your wife has parents? So their relationship is machatanim. There's no word in English for that.
But in-laws doesn't qualify?
No, my in-law are my spouse's parents.
Uh-huh.
Your mother-in-law or your father-in-law
Right.
are sweet and wonderful people who I happen to know,
Sure.
who are your wife's parents. Those
Right.
are in-laws.
Those are my in-laws.
Those are in-laws. My in-laws are my spouse's parents.
Right.
When God is good, Rabbi Gottlieb, and your children start to get married at the right time, I'm not
to
pushing.
think about that.
I know, I hate to bring that up right now. It's hard to imagine. Your relationship with their spouse's
No, I get it. I
parent,
just
you
thought
get
you
it?
could use that like,
No, I don't
like
think
a
so.
homonym, like in-laws, like the round, like.
I don't think so. Well, you'll check it out. He gave a eulogy, and he talks about that what he learned from his mother, the most important thing he learned from his mother is to feel the presence of the Almighty on his shoulders and the blessed connection, personal connection with God.
They read Rabbi Soloveitchik's essay from Family Redeemed on the Shekhinah and the feminine aspect,
Okay,
which
so
I think
that's a
he
piece of it.
touches on
Right.
some of that imagery.
Yeah, so how do you convey that? I have no idea.
Role models. I mean, that's a big piece
Role
of
models.
it. Yeah, that's one
And
piece.
if you're fortunate enough to have an experience like I did at the Western Wall, it's transformative. And that speaks also to experiences. But that also speaks to you have to be open to experiences. I bet you have transformative experiences all the time, and sometimes we don't really get it because we're not open. We're not prepared. We're busy. So we're not stopping to, oh my God, what just happened? It was amazing. It's amazing. We don't focus on it too much so we have to live a life of white space, of openness to this, and be hit by it.
Thank you so much, Rabbi.